Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, this is Cynthia Toolin-Wilson, and I'm here with Jon Sweeney in Author to Author. I'm going to interview Jon tonight about his book, Jesus Wasn't Killed by the Jews, Reflections for Christians in Lent. Before we start, I'll say a short prayer, and then Jon will introduce himself, and we'll talk about the book. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Okay, Jon, would you like to tell us something about yourself?
Well, sure, happy to, and I'm happy to be with you. Thanks for doing this. I'm anxious to talk about this new book. So, my name is Jon M. Sweeney. I'm an author and a book publisher. I'm a book publisher. I usually say my day job is that I'm a book publisher. I'm the publisher for a publishing house called Paraclete Press in Massachusetts, but I live in Milwaukee, and I work from home or remotely. Just wherever I happen to be is where I'm working, and then I'm in Massachusetts from time to time with all of my colleagues who live there. Book publishing is what I've always done since I left seminary when I was in my young 20s. There was a time when I thought I might be a priest or a professor or something like that, but I realized I loved books most of all, so I went into the book business. And I became an author myself about 20 years ago. I'm 52 years old now, and about 20 years ago I started writing books as well, and I do quite a bit of that sort of on the side, even though I do quite a bit of it. So that's part of my story. The other part, which is relevant to the topic of this book, is that I'm married to a rabbi. I was married once before. I was divorced. When I was married before, when I was younger, in my late 30s, I was the head of marketing at a Jewish publishing house in Vermont called Jewish Lights Publishing. We did great stuff, created Jewish inspirational literature, spirituality in the Jewish book market, which was very new back then in the 90s, when Jewish books usually meant Judaica kinds of stuff. Books on the Holocaust or theology and that sort of thing, and we were doing something different. So I did all of that, but as a Christian, I was the head of marketing there, which was kind of unusual, but it gave me a lot of good exposure and understanding. And so when I was single in midlife, the idea of asking a rabbi out on a date didn't seem quite so strange. and we ended up becoming engaged and getting married, and we just had our 10th wedding anniversary. So I often explain to people, like when I give a talk, I'll sometimes kind of explain my spiritual path, and I'll say that it's very strange, and then I think spiritual journeys often are sort of strange, and I always have a couple people who come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh, I'm so glad you said that because I'm so strange too," and we sort of relate to each other. So, in short, I'm a practicing Catholic who is a clergy spouse to a rabbi, and that's a little strange.
That sounds like a very interesting life.
It is. It keeps things interesting.
What was behind writing this particular book?
Well, most of all, I mean, in a timely way, what was behind it was the shooting that took place outside of San Diego last spring. Right after that happened, it was late April of 2019. I had the idea that we needed to do a book like this, and that we needed to do it quickly so that it could be available in time for Christians to study during Lent before we come upon Lent once again. because we had just gone through Lent and Easter when that tragedy happened. And, of course, that tragedy, which was outside of San Diego, was kind of fresh on the heels of the terrible Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, which had just been less than half a year before. Mm-hmm. So that was really the impetus for it. It's not as if anti-Semitic attacks and things of that sort are anything new. It's been going on for nearly 2,000 years, but and Christians have been doing them. But the one outside of San Diego, I found particularly troubling because, and I talk about this in the introduction to this book, is because the young man who did this, he was a 19-year-old, was interviewed afterwards, and he talked about being a Christian and doing this in part because he was a Christian. His rhetoric was kind of full of a mixture of sort of horrifying mixture of Christian language and white nationalist language. Right. But he talked about having been a member of a Presbyterian congregation church and learning in church that Jesus was killed by the Jews, and that somehow he thought it was being faithful to Christ by doing what he had done. So that's just so horrifying. And in the introduction to the book, I say that's so obviously wrong, but on the other hand, if it was obvious, there wouldn't be any need for a book like this.
Mm-hmm. True. And, of course, just recently we've seen more attacks, so in a grocery store in New York and in a synagogue. So that hasn't, it seems to have become more acceptable. Although I don't think that the two in New York were based in Christianity. I think they just were anti-Semites.
Yes, right.
Mm-hmm. But either way, people are dead, so it's a terrible tragedy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, and of course, I mean, the people who are listening to us, of course, know. It almost feels like you don't need to say it, but maybe some don't. That for centuries and centuries, there's a history of pogroms and anti-Semitic attacks, and even the rhetoric of the Nazi regime, and all of these horrifying examples of anti-Semitic hatred and killing of Jews have been rife with Christian language.
Yeah, and of course now we add on to that the fact that so many people deny that the Holocaust ever occurred. And although I don't for the life of me know how history can be rewritten when it's so, in such the recent past, there are many who do not think it occurred. So,
right.
Scary.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's this sense in which there is such a need for this book. Although, let me say this too, because some of the people who are listening to us might be academics. I mean, I know that you're a dean of a theological school. When I proposed the book right away to the publisher understood the need for it, and we got going right away. But when I talked to some potential contributors at the beginning, their hesitation was, well, we don't need a book like this because all of this has been written before. And that was really interesting to me, because that is what an academic would say. I mean, that is what anyone who's versed in the literature of this sort of stuff would say that, because it's true. I mean, there's nothing new in Jesus wasn't killed by the Jews. There's no groundbreaking research. But we've done such a bad job of learning what's in Jesus wasn't killed by the Jews. We've done such a bad job of, I mean, for instance, Catholics haven't really begun to sort of absorb the teachings of Nostra Aetate, which is one of the chapters in the book. Told us that we should stop hating the Jews and blaming them for killing Jesus. You ask the average Catholic, and they don't understand that yet. So anyway, that was my argument was, yeah, you're right. I mean, we're not going to say anything in this book that hasn't been said elsewhere, but this needs to keep being said, and that was the reason why we put it together.
Actually, I think that you have some insights in here that I haven't seen before. And,
that's interesting.
You write very well. And, as I was going through the book, I teach Christology, and so one of the things that I talk about is that once the incarnation occurred, Jesus didn't go to heaven and just leave his body behind. He's still incarnate and always will be. And until you put down, and I mean, I knew it, but I didn't actually ever say it or ever actually really think it, but it's something you knew the minute you saw it, and it's that he was conceived a Jew, he was born a Jew, and he is still a Jew. It's not like all of a sudden he converted to Christianity.
Right.
So, but until I read that, and it was like, wow, why didn't I ever say that to anybody? I knew it, but I just never formulated it in my mind the way you had put it. That was very interesting. The other thing that literally blew me away was when you were talking about how, and you read in some of the different Gospels, and there's all this fighting going on. And the way it's interpreted today, we tend to think that fighting is going on between the followers of Christ and the Jews. And then all of a sudden you say, this was a family fight. And it was a rabbi talking to another rabbi. And it was like, you're right. But no one ever said that before that I know of. I mean, I was really excited when I read this book.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, and part of what we do is that, I mean, people will know this, when and hopefully if they hold it in their hands, is that it's a thin little book. I mean, this is not a scholarly tome, even though there are some scholars in it. I do not claim to be a scholar on this subject. I claim to have a passionate interest in it and have a lot of firsthand experience. And, I go to weekly Torah study, even though I'm a Catholic who goes to Mass. And so, my life kind of unusually is involved in Judaism and wanting to understand Judaism, but I'm not a scholar on this subject. But each of the chapters is intentionally short, to the point, and written, most of them. There's a couple of them that are a little heavy, I would be honest and say that, but most of them are intentionally written to be for the average person in the pew. Because when it comes to this subject, I'm kind of the average person in the pew. I'm just someone who has a real passion for wanting to communicate this stuff.
Well, you've done a very good job of communicating it.
Well, thank you. And then, once we put it together, it was such a pleasure to get the foreword to be written by Rabbi Abraham Skorka, who, as people probably will remember, is one of Pope Francis's best friends from Argentina. They wrote a book together. And then the afterword is by Amy Jill Levine, who has done really sort of more good work in this field than everybody else combined, the Jewish Annotated New Testament chief among them all. So anyway, we were able to get some real sort of luminaries attached to the book, and hopefully that'll help to get it the attention I think it deserves.
Oh, I think it deserves the attention too. So I don't know how you'd like to proceed. I thought maybe we could go through chapter by chapter and discuss a few of the concepts in it, if that's okay with you.
Sure. I mean, readers should know that I didn't write all the chapters. I only wrote 4 of them. So, I mean, the ones that I can go through the best are the ones that I wrote. But each one has something important to say for readers to get into this subject and understand it.
Okay. So you did tell us why you wrote the book, but also in the introduction you talk about Christians having been taught our faith as over and above and against other faiths, especially Judaism, for centuries. That is, I assume you're saying that we have been taught we are superior.
Yes.
And you add in the next paragraph, Jesus was Jewish, plain and simple. I love this. He wasn't just sort of Jewish or temporarily Jewish. That is perfect. Jesus was born a Jew and died a Jew. It's beautiful.
It's just astonishing how Christians don't understand this. I mean, and I'm encountering it almost hourly right now, because the book's publication date actually was today, the day that we're recording this. And so
Congratulations.
And so I'm in a lot of conversations with people. Some of them are online, and some of them are interviews and things where people don't understand this, and they often just reject it because it sounds so wrong to them. How can Jesus be Jewish? I mean, Jesus was Christian, of course. I mean, it's almost like the argument that happened a few years ago about, Santa Claus is obviously white. It's one of those things that people just assume they know the answer to, and they haven't really thought it through. It's not a matter of studying. I mean, I don't expect the average person who goes to Mass to study theology. I mean, there's no need, really. But, I mean, it's something that's sort of in the context of our gospel readings that we don't pick up, or that maybe that our pastors don't emphasize enough or teach clearly enough. I don't know. But, yes, Jesus was Jewish, plain and simple.
It's not temporarily either. I love that. But, so this chapter is very interesting. Another good point that I think most people don't recognize. On page 20, in the first full paragraph, you say, but the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament describes as ancient Israelite religion involving priests, animal sacrifice, and a central temple in Jerusalem. This changed rapidly at about the same time the first followers of Jesus began calling themselves Christians. The century of Jesus is the century of the birth of both Christianity and what we know today as Judaism, what Jews and Judaism call Rabbinic Judaism. That's beautiful. And it really adds to that idea of the reality, I should say, of the two brothers, the two brother religions.
Yes.
So that was striking to me. So, here you have this one little chapter, and, you said two very significant things there.
Well, and that also might just bridge us to what you're referring to is from the introduction, and that might just bridge us to talking about chapter 1 as well, because chapter 1 is titled, You Can't Understand Judaism Simply Reading the Old Testament. And just like the comment that Jesus was Jewish, plain and simple, this is another comment, you can't understand Judaism simply reading the Old Testament, that most Christians don't understand, and some of them, won't accept, because this is their worldview. Is the Old Testament is the Jewish part of the Bible that they hold, and the New Testament is the Christian part. I mean, that alone is a problem, but a lot of Christians think that. And Jesus came to the Jews, and they rejected him, and they crucified him, and we accepted him, and so we are Christians, and so the old is the old and the new is the new. I mean, these are the paradigms in which we tend to think and move, even though hopefully we've not been taught that way, but maybe we have. So I start off that first chapter by saying that I was talking with a professor of religion friend the other day, and he told me that the majority of the students that walk into his class that he teaches on the Old Testament think that they understand Judaism from the Old Testament, and I sarcastically, because I've heard this so many times, I think I just sort of sarcastically responded and said, well, don't they wonder where the priests are in the animal sacrifice? And he said, oh, well, they assume they do that too, and that's why Jews are so scary, It's horrifying. It's terrifying.
Yep, it is. Especially in today's world. I mean, you would think that, with all the courses, even in secular institutions, there are courses on multiple religions, so you have to wonder what they're being taught in those classes. And I mean, here at the seminary, we have a course in interreligious dialogue, and although we don't go into the beliefs of every religion in the detail that it could justify, because it's only a 15-week course, but it's like anyone who would walk out thinking that people are still, the Jews are still killing animals in the synagogue, mind you, not in the temple. It's scary.
Right. Well, and what you just pointed to is the other thing, is that I think most Christians don't pause to understand or ponder where did that word synagogue, where did that even come from? Because they don't find that in the Old Testament. So that's part of the story about how Christianity and and what we call Judaism today were both born at about the same time. The synagogue and the church were born at about the same time, and a lot of it has to do with Jesus. Not all of it has to do with Jesus, but they're both about 2,000 years old. So that's an important place where the book starts.
Yes. And on page 26, you said something to that effect that what we know as Judaism is only as old as the Christian Church. Judaism and Christianity are siblings. When you think of it, we both believe in the one God.
Right.
As do, of course, Muslims. But the Christian understanding obviously is different. But at that time, there was something going on that made people realize that there's only one God.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and in that way, I think it was quite deliberate that Pope John Paul II, who played a major role in trying to teach us these things that we have not learned yet well enough, made the comment that has become kind of a important benchmark in this conversation, that the Jews are our elder brothers. That's what he called the Jewish people, speaking of how Jews relate to Christians. They are our elder brothers. I think that relates directly to the idea that we're siblings, and not just siblings, but the Jews are our elder brothers and sisters.
Yes, and we owe respect to the elder.
Exactly.
So, the other thing that I noted that on page 26, when you're talking about the Pharisees, Jesus argues with the Pharisees. It isn't a case of two faiths debating, but two rabbis debating. That was that section that I found so impressive. So think about it that way the next time you read the Gospels, where Jesus is correcting a Pharisee. Jesus was colleague and cousin with the Pharisees. They were his fellow Jews and fellow teachers of the Torah. That's so important for people to read and understand.
Yeah, what is typically taught in Sunday school about the meaning of Pharisee and who the Pharisees were, and then even the word Pharisaical. Those are all teachings and terms that, whether we know it or not, are sort of tinged with an anti-Jewish perspective.
Definitely. Then there's chapter 2, Israel is my firstborn son. Rather long chapter by Walter
Brueggemann, who's one of the real, premier Hebrew Bible scholars of the last 50 years. I was delighted that he was able to do this. And it's such a pivotal. He asked me. I asked him if he would write for the book, and he said, "Well, it's not exactly my area, sort of anti-Semitism in the church or anything like that." And I asked him specifically if he would write on this phrase from Exodus chapter 4, "Israel is my firstborn son." And he was able to do it without being political, which is good. I think it's important for listeners to know this is not a book about politics. There's nothing about politics in this book. There's nothing about the modern state of Israel and the Palestinian situation. Nothing about that in this book. This is the kind of conversation about Israel being the firstborn son where you could get political, but it doesn't. That's not the purpose here. The purpose here is to say, what does it mean to be Israel's firstborn son, and then what does it mean to be the next son and the next son after that, as you referred to before. Christianity and Islam would be, for instance, those two other sons. And there's a way in which the sons have to relate to each other. There's the responsibility and the privilege of the firstborn son, both. And that's what this chapter talks about. But it's a good way of getting into that issue.
Yeah, and especially to understand Middle Eastern culture, which, as you say on page 28, the imagery is unapologetically situated in a patriarchal system of primogeniture. In that system, fathers had a peculiar commitment to their firstborn son, a commitment voiced, for example, in the story of Esau, the helplessness of Isaac in Genesis 27. So that's very important because it is a culture that is patriarchal still to a great extent. And, that makes us understand more the importance not only of the son, but of the firstborn son. It's a very interesting point made there on page 28.
Yes, good. I'm glad that stuck out.
Oh, it did. I really do like this book. Okay. Okay, what else would you like to say on this chapter?
Well, I think that's the essential point. I mean, I really do. I think that's the essential point.
Okay. Alrighty. Let's see. Chapter 3, which I'm having trouble changing the page. Christianity's Complicated Origin by Mary Boyce.
Yeah, you must know Mary Boyce from her work in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
She is terrific and is one of the real experts in this field. So again, I was so delighted that she was able to participate in this. But I think the importance here is, she points out that the typical rendition of the origins of Christianity kind of goes like this, and I'm quoting from her. Christianity fulfills the promises God made to Jews in the Old Covenant. And in my experience, if you read that sentence or say that sentence to a room of 10 Christians, 8 or 9 of them will say, "Yeah, that's absolutely been my experience. That's the truth, right?" So she goes on to talk about this in careful ways. What, for instance, Christians having misused the word legalism to understand Judaism and Jews, and what stood out for you here?
I think mostly this adherence to the law of Torah as a way of life, but over time became mired in legalism. Again, exemplified by the Pharisees. They are the bad boys. So Jesus' way of love, in contrast to the law of the Jews, threatened Jewish authorities. So I have heard that kind of talk within the church. That it was, the Pharisees were concerned with Jesus' radicalism. So, and then authorized the crucifixion. So Pilate authorized the crucifixion, but it was really because of the Jews.
Right.
So that is something that has been, I don't know if I'd say it's been deliberately taught. I think it's just something that's passed on through the ages.
Right.
So,
right.
But then we get into this. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, she highlights again the way in which Christianity and Judaism really grew up together in the first and second century. We have to understand them that way. We have to understand the Jewish context of Jesus. We have to understand the Jewish context of not just the Old Testament but the New Testament. And we have to understand the way in which Jews and Christians are forever linked because of those things, but also because really the two religious movements began at the same time, and they were both born by Jews.
Yeah, it's also interesting, about the misconceptions of Christians. We think of the first generations of the disciples of Jesus, including Peter, James, and Mary Magdalene, as Christians. Now, obviously, they were the original members of the church, but it's important to understand that. And then also Paul as a convert from Judaism, So there's a lot of interesting points here about the people that we talk about in the church all the time, the people that were alive at that time, and our misconceptions of them. This whole section on a perspective grounded in contemporary biblical scholarship is very nice. That starts on page 38.
Yep. Well, and what you were just highlighting actually takes us right into chapter 4. And I think it's important to say, if people haven't figured this out already, that in many cases here, the chapter title is actually meant to sort of say a lot. So the chapter title 4 is the New Testament was written entirely by Jews. And again, that's one of those statements where if you try and explain that to a room of 10 Christians, I think you'll have 8 of them wanting to argue with you.
Probably all.
But but this is the case. All of the writings of the New Testament are written by Jews. Jesus never walked into a church. And this one is by Nicholas King, who's a Jesuit, who's a scholar, a priest in England, but he also does a great job of communicating in a very lively way for sort of the ordinary reader. He writes often for The Tablet, which is the Catholic newspaper published in London.
So just going through, Paul the Jew, Mark's Gospel, unmistakably Jewish, Matthew, Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism. I mean, it's like he goes on with this very same point. It's an important point. So,
if you look at Paul's letters, as Nicholas King, does, he'll show you what is distinctively Jewish about them, as he does with Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel and John's Gospel, Luke's Gospel. Each one in a different way can be seen to be distinctively Jewish and reflect the authorship of it.
Interesting about the Gospel of Matthew on page 48, because it has, as is mentioned here, it is sometimes regarded as the most anti-Jewish of the Gospels, based primarily on chapter 23. I like in the parentheses, which you should read only if you're feeling strong. But anyway, down a little bit further down in that paragraph, it's the first full paragraph on page 48. Christians down the centuries have admittedly used it for pouring the wholesale public way on our Jewish brothers and sisters, but they have missed the point. What we have here is not an attack on Jews as such, but the familiar tones of religious sibling rivalry, one Jewish group assailing another. When I read that, if you have a bunch of rabbis together today, I don't know about your wife, but if you have a bunch of rabbis together and you bring up a point of law, a lot of times there'll be some heated argument, not fight, but there'll be a lot of that give and take. It's a tradition. And here,
I think canon lawyers do the same thing. I mean, this is the way. This is the way you argue and sometimes learn.
Yeah, and it might be some obscure point of the law, and you're right, canon lawyers too. But that's such an important thing here. It's the familiar tones of religious sibling rivalry. So it is not what it has been taken to be by so many people. It's an excellent point. Let's see. Okay, was there anything else that you wanted to address in chapter 4?
No, I think chapter 4 is really so sort of clear. I mean, I think we've covered it. And honestly, I feel that chapter 5 is similar too. It's called supersessionism / replacement theology, and just simply the title, replacement theology, says what this one's about. And most Christians don't understand that they hold, because a lot of Christians don't even feel that they hold anything theologically probably at all, but if you start to ask them questions about what they believe theologically about Jews and Christians and Old Testament, New Testament, and Jesus, and etc., you will reveal that they probably are people who believe or have been taught a sort of replacement theology, even though at least clearly in the Catholic Church since 1965, since the Second Vatican Council, and each of the last 3 popes have made it very clear that this is not the teaching of the Church, but nevertheless, this is what we seem to imbibe, and I'm not sure how or why, but this is the reason why this book is necessary.
I agree. I remember years ago, probably 30, 40 years ago, I'm old, 30 or 40 years ago, I was talking to somebody, and another woman, and I said that I didn't understand the extent to which so many Christians hated Jews. And her reply is, well, because the religion is defunct. It's been replaced by Christianity.
Oh, my.
And she actually used the word replaced. So when I
my.
saw this replacement theology, I was like, exactly. That is exactly what some people believe. It's like Judaism is a religion that has been replaced, so it should just go away. And they're just too stubborn to do so.
Yeah. The doctrine of supersessionism says that the new covenant through Jesus Christ supersedes the old covenant, which was the one made with the Jewish people. And that is not the teaching of the Catholic Church. Clearly, it's not the teaching. It is not what has been made very clear by the last several popes. There are moments in Catholic history and teaching where you will find some of that kind of teaching, but we've made it very clear in the last 60 years that this is not the teaching of the Church, that those have been mistakes.
Yeah, I think part of the problem, although the teaching has been clarified since Vatican, with the writings of Vatican II, as a seminary professor, I can tell you that the majority of people have never picked up a document from Vatican II, and if they did, they probably didn't work all the way through it. So professionals, theologians, priests, people in seminary who are forced to sit in Vatican II classes, they know these things. But I think that that's where the problem lies. It's not actually translated from the professionals who know this information. I'm not saying professional like a priest isn't called to this. That's not what I'm saying. But the people who learn this and then go out and teach it, need to do a better job. Well,
that certainly has been my experience with talking with friends who teach in seminaries like yours. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my friends often tell me that a further part of the problem is that there's this perception among younger priests in particular, or would-be priests, that the teachings of Vatican II and those who want to emphasize the teachings of Vatican II are of an older generation that is too progressive for their tastes, and so they don't really want to listen to those teachings so much. I have even been at events at a seminary, for instance, where a rabbi is invited to come and give a talk on subjects like the ones that you and I are talking about right now, and some of the younger seminary students express that they have not a whole lot of understanding or interest in the talk because their understanding is that Jews need to become Christians and that their job as priests or would-be priests is to be an evangelist to the Jewish people, which, again, is not the teaching of the Church. There's this way in which some of it seems generational and some of it is just that we're not communicating clearly enough, I think.
Yeah, I do agree with the generational effect, that's for sure. But I do think that we do need to work harder, theologians, professors. We need to work harder to make sure that our students understand these teachings. I mean, Vatican II, even to cover it in the Vatican II documents, not the whole history of Vatican II, but just the documents, to cover all of that in one semester is an enormous job. You really are just giving a basic outline with some filling in, but more needs to be done. There's no question of that.
Yeah.
So let's see. You wrote Chapter 6, Spiritual Practices on Ash Wednesday. What would you like to say?
Well, I'll tell the story that the chapter tells, because the chapter is really meant to sort of tell a story, which is that, as I mentioned at the outset, I'm a practicing Catholic who's married to a rabbi, so that makes my experience a little unusual. And one year we were living in Brooklyn, and I went to Mass on Ash Wednesday, as I always do. And since we were living in Brooklyn, I was walking back to our apartment, and I walked past 3 or 4 synagogues in just the few blocks that it took me to get back to the apartment. And I had just been at Mass where we had the reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, where Jesus, says to the disciples, go and perform good deeds and repent of your sins, and don't do it like the hypocrites. It has that, that phrasing. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites who love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on street corners so that others may see them.
Yeah.
And as I was walking back to the apartment, and this was, Mass was replaying in my mind, and, Ash Wednesday is such an important day that the whole thing was kind of replaying as I was walking, and I'm walking past these synagogues, and it suddenly occurred to me, I wonder how many of my fellow Catholics who were sitting there next to me at Mass, I wonder how many of them are walking home right now and walking past a synagogue and thinking to themselves, wow, I'm glad I'm not like those Jews in the synagogue, like the text says. Because what they don't understand, and this is one of the points that I make at a few points in the book, is that I think our pastors and our teachers could do a better job of giving context to our readings and our rituals from time to time, particularly during Lent, which is why this is a book where the subtitle is Reflections for Christians in Lent, because I think it'd be really good if before we had such a reading that says don't be like, those hypocrites in the synagogues, it needs to be read really as don't be like those hypocrites in the churches. Because when that was written, there were no churches. So the synagogues were the churches. But today, 2,000 years removed, we read it thinking to ourselves as removed and separate from the criticism that is being levied. And that's our mistake on so many levels.
Yeah, those are good points. Yeah, so that's on page 63. Scripture should never be a condemnation of someone else. Hearing the reading of hypocrites in the synagogues for our lives would mean substituting the word churches for synagogues, because we aren't hearing the reading while standing in the synagogue. Very good. Yeah, and certainly I agree with you. Okay.
Well,
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say the next chapter is also one of the ones written by me. So I wrote the Ash Wednesday chapter, the Maundy Thursday chapter, and the Good Friday chapter. So chapter 7 is caution about Maundy Thursday Passover Seders, and this one is a little unusual because this chapter has me giving some guidelines as someone who has been to more than a person's share of Passover Seders since I'm married to a rabbi. I mean, most Christians in my experience, even, very sort of interfaith involved Christians, only go to a couple of Passover Seders in their lives because, why would you go to 3 or 4 a year unless you're married to a rabbi as I am?
Right.
So I've been to a lot of them, and there's ways to do it well and there's ways to not do it well. And that's what this chapter is about. And I think I can summarize it most of all by just saying that I think the real guideline that Christians should follow when having a Passover Seder is not to Christianize the Seder, but to use it as an opportunity to understand the Jewish context from which their faith, Christian faith, grew out of. Because too often we changed all of the symbols to become Christian symbols, and then we're really stealing from the ritual. We're stealing it and turning it into something else. We're not doing a Passover Seder. We're doing a Christian Seder, and that's a different thing. And frankly, it's a thing that I'm not interested in doing. So if you can have a local rabbi come and lead the Passover Seder, that's the best way to do it. But otherwise, just drawing parallels is okay. It's okay to talk about how this teaching in the Seder is really interesting to me because it relates to this Christian teaching or this understanding that I have as a Christian. But to take the Jewish understanding of the ritual itself, which has many, many steps, a Passover Seder, a good one, goes on for 2 or 3 hours, to turn it into a Christian event is to misunderstand the Seder and I think to do something wrong to Jews and Judaism.
Yeah. So context. You say we need. That's true. on page 70 you say something that I think is very important. Most of all, I want to remind each one of us in church on Good Friday of what number 3 clearly states. We are the ones who are to blame for the crucifixion and death of Jesus. For those of us who look to Christ for salvation, this is the very crux of our faith. Someone else is not to blame. We are the one who made Christ's death on the cross necessary. Absolutely. Christ came because he had to give, not had to, Christ came to give the sacrifice so that we would be forgiven of our sins. Everybody's sins. You know,
yes.
All original sin, personal sin, social sin, all of these sins. You know, so that's a very important point on page 70 at the bottom.
Yes. Now, just I need to say that that's from chapter 8. So you went from Monday, Thursday, chapter 7 to chapter 8. So I just want to make sure that listeners know that.
I didn't realize I did that.
Well, no, that is so. But you're moving on to the. We just talked about Passover Seders on Monday, Thursday, because Monday, Thursday is the day when most Christians who are interested in a Seder tend to think of it as something that would happen on Monday, Thursday, because most people probably accept that the Last Supper was a Seder. I should have said that before. And then chapter 8 is the next day, Good Friday, which is really sort of the crux of the book, because again, when we're in church on Good Friday, we have the gospel reading performed. It's the only time in my experience. I mean, if I haven't been to church enough, I'd be surprised. It's the only time in my experience when every year the gospel reading is actually performed. You know, people get different parts and they practice and they stand in different parts of the sanctuary, and there's always someone who is playing the part of the Jews and says, "Crucify him, crucify him." Well, just like I said about Ash Wednesday, that's troublesome. And I sure wish that our pastors, and in my experience it just doesn't happen very often, would give that the context that it needs, so that people don't listen to it and walk out of church thinking to themselves, those terrible Jews, how could they have killed my Lord?
Yeah. Sorry, I actually skipped a page. Remember I told you I was having trouble turning the pages? Apparently I really had trouble there.
Well, no, that's fine.
About that. But I do find it an interesting point, because the context does need to be brought in there. We are all guilty of this, because we're all born in the Christian tradition. Of course, we understand this in the Jewish tradition. No, that we believe that we are born in the Catholic world. We believe that, and I think most Christians, that we are born with original sin. And so that is the big issue here. So none of us are without, in the Catholic belief, none of us are without original sin. None of us are without personal sin. There are saints, of course. But so we are all responsible for the death of Christ. And I have heard priests say that. I have heard people say that at Mass and, people talking in classes. And we emphasize that. When I teach Christology, I always emphasize that. But it's hard to see that when you're hearing just crucify him. So you're right about context. Something needs to be said to explain that, because the people that are sitting in the pews are not scripture scholars, nor are they, cultural anthropologists, or interreligious dialogue people. They need to be told what this means.
Right.
So I feel very strongly about that, and I was very glad to see you say this on the bottom of page 70.
Right. And I want to be really clear with listeners that not for a moment do I expect in general or in this book to suggest that the average person in the pew needs to be studying theology,
no.
which is why the questions in the chapters are very simply phrased and stated. If I were to sort of plead for anything in the church, it would be that our pastors would take a more active role in teaching these things, but also just giving very simple context. to when we have things like the gospel reading on Good Friday or the gospel reading on Ash Wednesday. I think it's important.
Well, yeah, not only that, though. I mean, certainly in CCD class, there's something like this, could be brought up. Some of the things we've been talking about could be brought up. Adult ed classes, certainly faith formation classes. You can add just a few sentences, and it can make a real difference in people's attitudes. Because they'll understand something better. Okay, did you want to go on to chapter 9?
Yes, we might as well.
The Great Commandment.
Yeah, what stood out for you? What stood out for you in this one? I mean, for me, again, this is an emphasis that Jesus was a rabbi, and the author, who's Robert Ellsberg, who's really sort of the authority on Dorothy Day and many other things, but points out, the ways and the reasons that Jesus' preaching provoked controversy, because that's what a rabbi did in the first century. And offers, a way to understand Jesus and his critique of his fellow Jews.
Yeah. I like on page 73. Of course, you get that very good example in that first paragraph. Two kinds of people: good religious people and sinners, whom Jesus loved. How it oversimplifies, but yeah, on page 73, you've got that very interesting. If Jesus' differences were not with the Jews, in quotation marks, or Pharisees as such, there is no doubt that he publicly challenged certain attitudes: legalism, hypocrisy, exclusivism, chauvinism, self-righteousness. Excellent, this next sentence. These are not singularly Jewish or Pharisaic attitudes. They were and are among the particular temptations or occupational hazards of those who take their religion most seriously.
Yes.
So that is really good writing. And then also talking about the Good Samaritan. So, very good. When we see a list like that, we don't like to think about it as being something that belongs to us too. But it does. So.
Yes, it does. Definitely. And we, frankly, if we're good Christians, then we see these as applying to ourselves too. We don't put them on the other person.
Exactly. Yeah, so. Also on page 75, you've got this very beautiful sentence. It actually starts on 74 from Francis. In short, Pope Francis has faced opposition from many good religious people, including scribes and clergy from his own church, and for reasons not unlike the controversy that Jesus encountered. Because of his scandalous mercy, because he seems to emphasize the spirit of the letter of the law, because he suggests that God's love is not the special property of Christians, nor is this simply a Catholic problem. There are good religious people among Protestants of every stripe, as there are among Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and Jews. So, who am I to judge? And the fact that he, he said that of homosexuals, and, that he washed the feet of inmates and women and Muslims.
Right.
I mean, it's like, so, really, that's some very good writing, making some very good points. Okay.
Yes.
Is there anything else in chapter 9?
No.
Okay. Then we have chapter 10, why we need to translate. Oh, dear. How do you pronounce that word? Ioe?
Oh. You're the Greek scholar, aren't you?
No, not even remotely.
Well, I'm not either. So I remember in seminary, I took Greek, and that was a long time ago. But it's the word in the New Testament that we translate as Jews, and the author Wes Howard Brooke of this chapter argues that we need to translate the word that is often translated as Jews as Judeans, and that is a more accurate way to translate it. It's such a small little point. Again, each one of these chapters, in a way, is often just a small point. And And the point he's making is that when we're accusing the Jews of things, which is wrong in the first place, but when the text says that the Jews were doing certain things or said certain things or yelled crucify him, it's the Judeans, and that is a further way of understanding the subtlety of this being a inter-Jewish issue or event that's going on.
Yeah, which is a very important point. Let's see.
The paragraph that stuck out for me in Wes Howard Brooks' chapter here is the one on page 82, where he says, neither Jesus in John, meaning the Gospel of John, nor John the Baptist in the Gospel of Luke could imagine God wanting people to abandon the covenant. The opposite is true. They were calling people back to the covenant. In other words, the struggle was not in any way between quote-unquote Jews and quote-unquote Christians. It was between different understandings of what it means to be the people of God.
Yes. Yeah. So recognition of the same God, but how to worship and how to relate to Him.
Right.
Very different understandings, I guess, at that time, that in many ways have solidified over time. Okay. And then we have chapter 11. So we have this beautiful document from Vatican II on the relations with the Jews.
Yes, the famous Nostra Aetate, which was promulgated in 1965. And was a dramatic shift in the official teaching of the Church on Christians and the Jews. The author of this chapter of the book is Massimo Fagioli, who really is the expert in the field. So I was pleased and honored that he was able and willing to write a chapter for the book. But his chapter is called "From the Teaching of Contempt," which was the reference, the way in which we used to, in the Church pre-Vatican II, understand Jews, to Nostra Aetate, shift of Vatican II. I mean, if people just might need to be reminded of what Nostra Aetate did. I mean, crucially, it rejected the charge that the Jewish people are responsible for Jesus' death. So this goes right to the title of the book. Jesus wasn't killed by the Jews, which was an accusation that was used for centuries to justify persecution of the Jews, and is still today, as we said at the top, used to justify persecution of the Jews. Nostra Aetate kind of famously says, and I'm quoting the document, "What happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction then alive, nor against the Jews of today." And then the document goes on to, decry hatred, persecution, displays of anti-Semitism of any kind, and so on and so on. And it beautifully says, this is a phrase that I always remember from Nostra Aetate, refers to Christians and Jews as like a well-cultivated olive tree onto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles. That's the analogy of Jews to Christians. So anyway, the whole chapter just explains how this happened. What was the setting in the Church before Vatican II? What happened at Vatican II? And that these were the kinds of changes that happened at Vatican II.
Now, this is a very long chapter, and it's well worth spending the time reading because it goes into a great deal of detail. So one of the things that struck me interestingly is when you think of the person who is, the person who becomes Pope, John the 23rd, and he just happened to be a person who had sensitivity to the Jewish people. He was a papal diplomat in Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece, and France. So he had quite a bit of experience with Jews. So I always look at something like that, and I think it was very clever of God to make him the Pope at the right time.
Absolutely. I like thinking about it that way.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, so this is really one of the more deep chapters as far as going through some theology, but it's well worth for the readers. It's well worth working your way through. Chapter
yes.
12.
Good.
Yeah, I agree. Differences among early Jesus followers. Paul's warning to the Thessalonians.
Yes, and this one is by Bishop Richard Skilba, who's just recently, just in the last year, has retired from the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Has been a bishop in Milwaukee for decades. This is probably the most subtle chapter in the book, I would say.
Okay.
What did you draw from this one? I'm curious.
I particularly enjoyed the section on the Acts of the Apostles. The journeys of Paul and insight into the early missionary activity of the Christians. This first paragraph in 95 was supposed to be describing Paul's ministry to the Gentiles based on the initial example of Peter himself. The text, claiming careful study of sources, attempted to document Paul's missionary activities through the Roman Empire from the place of his dramatic conversion on the way to Damascus. The years between those events were filled with countless missionary travels, each somehow at the mandate of the authorities in Damascus. So going through, again, a lot of the reconstruction of this history of Paul and his activity. It's like when we read in the different letters, I don't think we get a sense of what his life really must have been like. And what that tells me is what a dramatic conversion he had. I mean, we know it was dramatic, but to live the life that he lived after that is, it's one of the most important lives in the history of the church, I think.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then the text that Bishop Skilba takes up to address is when Paul, and it's kind of a long quotation, so maybe I shouldn't read it all, but it's from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16. He looks at what Paul says, really Paul's complaint, and he gives it context for understanding, with like I said, with a lot of subtlety and a great grasp of what was going on in the first century.
Yeah, and there was a lot going on that people really today are not aware of. We just don't know the history. People sitting in the pews certainly don't know the history.
Right.
So
there's a way in which Paul, for certain comments of his, has been described, or maybe can be described sometimes as being anti-Jewish, but yet Paul was Jewish. So you have to understand the context in which really these arguments, these disputes were going on.
Oh, sure. Well, I think that's something we need to realize, because certainly, I'm very Catholic, but sometimes there are things Catholics do that I don't like. And, I'm willing to speak about those things. But that's something that you can see today. Certainly Paul was doing the same thing in his time. Just something that needed to be fixed. Then we have chapter 13, for fear of the Jews, anti-Semitism in John's time and in ours.
Yeah, and again, I'm interested to know what stands out for you here. What's interesting for me here is that, again, just in the big picture, I've been surprised how often frankly, I've been surprised how often that priests do not acknowledge or seem to notice the anti-Jewish statements that we just referred to, that Paul sometimes has, like in 1 Thessalonians, and then also in the Gospel of John. There's a context of the Gospel of John which I'm not sure how you can read it without noticing or realizing that there is this sibling rivalry going on, which was going on then between Christians and Jews in some of the things that John has to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think page 103, first and foremost, where Greg Garrett says, first and foremost, fear of the Jews is a ridiculous and inaccurate statement of why the followers of Jesus are gathered behind locked doors in the gospel lesson. These men are Jews, all of them. Peter's a Jew.
Yeah.
Thomas is a Jew.
Right.
The risen Jesus, the anointed one who steps miraculously into their midst, is a Jew. I had to laugh at that. In fact, as it's mentioned elsewhere in this book, virtually every character in the Gospel of John with a speaking part, almost everyone in Jesus' story is a Jew. The disciples are not afraid of the Jews per se. That would just be silly, like groundhogs being followed and frightened by their own shadows. So it's very interesting. A little further on it goes along, and it's like all the same to the same question. What religion was Jesus? And uninformed people often respond Christian. So, we can say he was Jewish until the cows come home, evidently, but it doesn't really stick with people, I guess. Anyway, again, the context and the information that we get from reading this about this gospel is beautiful.
Yeah, good. No, I'm glad you felt that way. And I, at the risk of sounding too devotional, I would just say that I think there's such a temptation in the human heart to scapegoat, and what we need to remember to do is to focus on our own sins and our own fault and our own the way in which we are those who crucified Jesus, who required the death of Jesus. And we need to understand that, like any document that is written at a place and time, there's always a context that needs to be understood. And in a lot of these New Testament writings, we haven't fully appreciated the Jewish context in all that means in which they were written.
Yeah, I agree. Chapter 14 by the rabbi, what do we say to our children? Is this by any chance your wife?
No. This is Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, who is closer to the age of my mother.
Okay.
I've known her for 25 years. I'm a big fan of her work. She's best known as, in the Jewish world, she's best known as being the second woman ever in the world to become a rabbi. She co-led a synagogue in Indianapolis with her husband Dennis, who is still the rabbi there. They co-led a synagogue together for 40 years, for a very long time. She's kind of legendary in Indianapolis, but she wrote children's books that have sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Books called God's Paintbrush, In God's Name. Anyway, that she's known probably best in the broader world as an author of best-selling children's books. So no one better than her to kind of conclude the book by saying, all right, now what do we teach our children? Because it's the next generation always that matters. And I think she has some powerful things to say and good wisdom here.
Yeah. On page 112, the category of Jew in quotation marks is used to speak of people who adhere to Judaism. There is no distinction between or among observant, non-observant, or secular Jews, or between American, Middle Eastern, or European Jews, Black or Hispanic Jews. This categorization becomes stereotyping when we say that Jews focus on law, a mistranslation of Torah, which means teaching. Then the stereotype turns to prejudice when that law is said to be opposed to compassion, the latter being deemed superior to the former.
Right.
So, yeah, and then it goes on about the New Testament. It's very interesting. She writes well.
Yes, she does. And I would add writes well, meaning writes plainly, easy to understand. That's an overlooked gift. Yes.
Mhm. Yeah. So, this is a very interesting chapter. Knowing that Hillel, on page 113, a Jewish sage in the 1st century BCE, taught, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor," helps children recognize the golden rule as an integral part of Judaism and not a Christian innovation. So,
right.
That's important for us to realize.
Very big misunderstanding. Another one of those big misunderstandings that Christians have.
Yes. And, is there anything else that you saw of interest in that? What do we say to our children?
I think she goes on to say that, we tend to summarize Christianity as sort of over against Judaism by saying things like Christianity is all about love and grace, and Judaism is all about rules and how to be righteous. And these are unfair characterizations, and there's a way in which they're ignorant characterizations too. They just come from not understanding. But they have sort of a Sunday school quality, and what I mean by that is, there's this pedagogical ease of saying things. Like if you say it that way, it's so easy to remember. Oh, okay, so that's a way to remember what the old Judaism was all about, and then what Jesus did that was special and different. And then it's so easy to remember, even though it's wrong and inaccurate, and that's why it's dangerous. And then of course it's dangerous because we imbibe these things, and some people imbibe them with other qualities, like the 19-year-old who shot up the Chabad synagogue outside of San Diego last April. He mixed his with a little bit of white nationalism, and he felt like he was being a good Christian by doing what he did. So that's the whole reason for Jesus wasn't killed by the Jews. That's why we put this book together.
Yeah, well, that 19-year-old shot people. I guess he didn't realize that God is the God of life.
Right.
For both of these religions.
Yes. Right.
Afterward, if not now, when? Would you like to speak a little bit about this? Very short.
Well, sure. If you want to. I mean, I think Amy Jill Levine really just sort of summarizes all that's been said. In a few cases, she actually argues with a little bit of interpretation here and there of what people have to say. So, whatever you think would be a good way to sort of conclude that.
Yeah. So I think it's a very good. It's a very good summary. She reemphasizes many of the same points. So I like page 122. Better would be to face the textual problems rather than to explain them away by hypothetical historical contractualization. Better would be to have the church groups move from general statements to providing specific guidance to pastors and priests on addressing the problematic text, and to fixing the lectionary where it gives a supersessionist impression. Better would be for church bodies to insist that candidates for ordained ministry learn about the Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism so that they do not bear false witness against Jews and Judaism. Better would it be for anyone who proclaims this text to picture Jewish children in the front pew. And to do this work, we need to listen to how texts around sound in the ears of our neighbors. We need to develop midrashim for reinterpretation. And we need to move finally from yet another general proclamation and yet another volume on why there is yet another attack on Jews, and do more in seminary education, requirements for ordination, liturgical readings, children and adult education, and interreligious studies. It's a very nice ending to the book.
Yeah.
So I think this is an important book. And I would say that to our readers. All you have to do is turn on the TV and see what is going on in the country right now with anti-Semitism, and people dying just because they happen to be Jews. So it's a serious issue, and we certainly should be addressing it in any way we can. And reading this book will give people a lot more information than they have at this point. So it's a good book.
Well, good. Thank you very much. I hope that many Christians will give it attention, particularly during this upcoming season, particularly as we enter Lent, because so much of these issues comes up sort of naturally in our texts and in our ritual and liturgy at times like Ash Wednesday and Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. So it's very important.
Yeah. I agree. A few minutes of explanation goes a long way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for granting me this interview. I've enjoyed it. And
my pleasure. Thank you for doing it.
You're welcome. And let me close with a quick prayer.
Okay.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary,
Amen.
full of grace. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen.
In the name
Thank
of
you
the
very
Father,
much.
and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You're welcome.
Amen.
And thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Goodbye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.